To bring down the walls of Jericho, the simple pickaxe is more useful than the mightiest trumpet. So wrote the 19th century German politician who coined the term Realpolitik. It's a lesson Germany has never forgotten. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 was a milestone on the road to European unity. It paved the way for the reunification and reinvention of Germany. The big question was, would it be a more European Germany or a more German Europe? Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the main architect of reunification, had no doubts. It's not a matter of more or less Europe, he wrote, but of whether we continue to build Europe or duck back into the old trenches. In the world order currently emerging, it's about making Europe a testing ground that everyone can recognize as just. A new Germany in a new Europe doesn't mean more power, but more responsibility. Responsibility for a world of equality, but not dominance. A world where everyone is always aware of the fact that a nation won't prosper in the long run if others permanently do poorly. But from the collapse of the Soviet Union at the beginning of the 1990s, German foreign policy increasingly undermined the position of Serbia, its wartime enemy and a traditional ally and client state of Russia. This was nothing new. In the 1970s, the French general and geopolitician Pierre Gallois attended regular European strategy meetings where German Defense Minister Franz Josef Strauss spelt out three main reasons.
Bonn pourrait estimer que c'est la résistance serbe qui, dans une certaine mesure, lui a fait perdre la Deuxième Guerre mondiale. Donc il fallait punir ce peuple. Deuxième idée, évidemment compréhensible de sa part, récompenser les Croates et les musulmans bosniaques qui, eux, s'étaient joints à l'Allemagne, à la Wehrmacht, et qui avaient même occupé certaines positions en France pendant la guerre, pour les remercier de s'être associés à l'action de l'Allemagne. Donc favoriser les Croates et les musulmans bosniaques. Troisième idée, du côté allemand, aussi, il était intéressant de faire entrer la Croatie et puis la Slovénie dans l'orbite économique de la communauté européenne occidentale, dirigée par l'Allemagne, et d'avoir ainsi une influence économique sur la côte dalmate, et par là, si vous voulez, se rapprocher de la Méditerranée. Vieux rêve allemand.
As one of Serbia's biggest investors and trading partners, Germany's influence has always been and remains a major determining factor in Serbian development. Economically, the relationship is one of unequal interdependence, and Serbia bears the indelible mark of German strategic and economic self-interest. When Croatia and Slovenia, the richest parts of Yugoslavia, unilaterally declared independence in June 1991, Germany broke ranks with its European partners by deciding to grant them almost immediate recognition. The move was internationally condemned as premature and dangerous. The EC first wanted a guarantee to protect the rights of Serbs and other minorities. Germany maintained that it wanted to preserve the integrity of Yugoslavia, but couldn't deny its people the right of self-determination. The 600,000 Croatians living in Germany and the Catholic CSU, one of the main ruling parties, piled huge public and parliamentary pressure on the government to deliver. But granting recognition was the spark that ignited ethnic tensions in the Balkan powder keg. For Serbs, it revived the spectre of wartime Nazi atrocities at the hands of the fascist Croatian Ustaša regime. It sent shockwaves through Serb communities within Croatia. Suddenly, they found themselves yet again facing an existential threat. Many of the 600,000 Serbs among the 4.5 million residents of Croatia rose up in rebellion. Surrounded and isolated within an independent sovereign Croatian state, they feared they would lose their lives and homes and be driven from land they'd settled for centuries. Folk memory could never forget the fact that Hitler had targeted Serbs along with the Jews and Gypsies for extermination. The Nazis had installed Anton Pavelić, a genocidal killer, as the puppet leader of an independent Croatia in 1941. Pavelić was founder of the Ustasha, or Rebel Party, a terrorist organization dedicated to the destruction of Yugoslavia. Its members swore oaths on blood and soil. The Ustasha brand of terror was uniquely shocking. Even the SS were appalled by the brutality in Croatian concentration camps like Jasenovac. Here, Serb men, women and children were tortured, butchered and burnt alive in their tens of thousands. Killings were carried out with medieval savagery, using hammers, axes and knives. Guards in one concentration camp held an obscene competition to see who could slaughter the greatest number of inmates in a single day, the gruesome record of 1,360 achieved with a specially adapted knife. Such barbarity was sanctioned from the top. Hitler himself told Pavelić that if the Croatian state was to remain strong, it must pursue a policy of national intolerance for 50 years. For every German soldier killed, 100 Serb civilians were publicly executed in reprisal. 50 were shot dead for every German wounded. Ustasha policy was to kill 1/3 of Serbs, deport 1/3, and forcibly convert the rest to the Catholic Church. It was quite openly a racist movement, and they were particularly proud of that, and you couldn't have a better example than Dr. Budak, who was the Minister for Religion and Education, who, when asked by a journalist what the government policy would be for non-Croat racial and religious minorities, said, "For them, we have 3 million bullets." At the end of 1941, the SS had already recorded a Serbian death toll of 300,000. This rose to well over 500,000 by the end of the war. Throughout the whole of Yugoslavia, German aggression cost a total of 1.7 million lives. The bombing of Belgrade was fueled by Hitler's rage that Serbian resistance had delayed the launch of Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union by a crucial 5 weeks. The onslaught on Yugoslavia tied up 8 German divisions desperately needed for the Russian front. But Hitler insisted that first Yugoslavia must be subjected to unmerciful harshness. This was his biggest military mistake and almost certainly cost Germany the war. Half a century on, in June 1991, such historic hostility was still hard to overcome. As components of a federal Yugoslavia, it was illegal for the republics of Croatia and Slovenia to unilaterally secede and declare independence without a nationwide poll. Neither republic met the conditions for statehood. International law requires a government in full control, clearly established borders, and a stable population, none of which applied in Croatia and Slovenia. German recognition was a flagrant and deliberate breach of the UN Charter and the Helsinki Final Act obligation to refrain from any action against the territorial integrity, political independence, or the unity of any participating state, which Yugoslavia clearly was. So what prompted Germany to grant recognition and preempt a fully negotiated response? Why did it break solemn undertakings given only weeks earlier to withhold recognition? Why did it break ranks with European partners and effectively force them to follow suit? The answer is a combination of 2 main factors: the strength of domestic pressure for recognition and the European weakness to resist it. The European project desperately needed consensus. The Maastricht Treaty, only signed in December 1991, bound members to a common foreign and defence policy. European unity could not be seen to fall at the first hurdle. The newly united Germany saw and seized a unique opportunity to realize a new national destiny and reinvent itself as a major power. Germany has traditionally emphasized the importance of ethnic identity. During reunification, the great rallying cry was "Wir sind ein Volk," we are one people. Afterwards, Germany saw itself as the natural champion of minorities seeking self-determination. The German political elite views the nation-state as increasingly inadequate and outdated, democracy as oppressive, a cause of conflict between nationalities. According to this school of thought, The objective is not the rule of the majority by elections, but exemption from majority rule for ethnic minorities. Michael Liebau, head of the German Foreign Ministry's Yugoslav department at the time, makes this clear. Serb hegemonies and Serb nationalism were far more to blame for the crisis than the secessionist forces, which were left no other choice than to try to escape the spectre of Serb domination. Hans-Dietrich Genscher took the view that hanging on to structures that people no longer want raises tensions in Europe. In May 1992, only 6 days after taking office as his successor, Klaus Kinkel declared, "We must force Serbia to its knees." As director of German military intelligence in the early 80s, it was Kinkel who'd virtually taken over the Yugoslav intelligence service, replacing pro-Yugoslavs with Croat officers known to favour secession. For Germany, the real significance of internationally recognizing Croatia and Slovenia was not that it would prevent military conflict, but that it would internationalize it. This point had already been spelt out in a speech in 1991 by Germany's former defense minister Rupert Scholz. He told military and business leaders, "The Yugoslav conflict is undeniably of fundamental pan-European significance. We are today still confronted with overcoming the consequences of the First World War. Yugoslavia is, as a consequence of the First World War, a very artificial construction, having nothing to do with the right of self-determination. In my opinion, Slovenia and Croatia must be immediately recognized internationally. When this recognition has taken place, the Yugoslavian conflict will no longer be a domestic Yugoslav problem where no international intervention can be permitted." The zeitgeist was perfect. It was the dawn of a new world order. A new generation, Tony Blair proclaimed in 1999, was drawing the line for values, a new internationalism where the brutal repression of whole ethnic groups will no longer be tolerated, and those responsible for such crimes will have nowhere to hide. In this supposedly new world of principles and values, human beings were more important than the state. For Germany, the Serbs were the problem in Yugoslavia because they favoured a multinational state to ethnic separatism. But the emphasis on race denies individual choice as the basis of democratic life. It denies those differences in outlook or interest which cut across the ethnic boundaries and determine political choices. A new Europe of peoples rather than states gave Germany, with its numbers and economic strength, the promise of a wider sphere of influence. Smaller folk states, grateful for recognition, would be more likely to accommodate German interests and ambitions. The prize of membership of the European Club would further promote compliance. The myth of Srebrenica was crucially important in erasing the stigma connected with the Second World War. Comparing Srebrenica to Auschwitz was for Germany a convenient means of relativizing and thereby trivializing Nazi barbarism and permitting it to resume its expansionist tradition. Germany used the Bosnian War as a pretext for international deployments by the German army under the cover of supposed humanitarian assistance. Ever since, high-ranking diplomats from Germany have been instrumental in determining the fate of Bosnia-Herzegovina and its economic destiny. Former Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer successfully used Srebrenica in his campaign to get the Green Party to abandon its anti-war principles and sanction military intervention, first only under UN auspices, then later as an act of aggression violating German law and international standards. State Secretary Wolfgang Ischinger justified intervention in Kosovo on the grounds that Belgrade was evidently attempting to force a military solution, making the systematic expulsion of the civilian population part and parcel of its military tactics. In view of this humanitarian catastrophe, the international community saw no alternative to trying to prevent further human suffering, oppression and violence against the civilian population by means of targeted airstrikes. Germany took part in the 78-day NATO bombing campaign that claimed to target the Yugoslav army and yet destroyed homes, schools, hospitals, factories, waterworks, power plants, Serb television and the Chinese embassy. It was claimed to be the only action that would prevent the ethnic cleansing of Albanians allegedly underway in Kosovo. NATO Commander General Wesley Clark repeatedly stated that the huge flood of refugees and heightened violence after the bombing began were entirely predictable. He said he knew nothing about any Serbian-planned ethnic cleansing of Albanians, the so-called Operation Horseshoe. The fact is, NATO bombing actually provoked rather than prevented the humanitarian catastrophe. The resulting devastation and dislocation was then used retrospectively to justify the action. Around 850,000 people fled, nearly half the population of Kosovo. According to the OSCE, 46% of Albanians left, but proportionately even more Serbs, 60%, fled Kosovo never to return. And yet the case for NATO intervention had been comprehensively rejected by a German court 2 weeks before bombing began. Munster's Upper Administrative Court, hearing asylum requests in February 1999, found no evidence in government sources to support the existence of a program of ethnic cleansing. Foreign Office status reports, it said, quote, do not allow the conclusion that there is group persecution of ethnic Albanians from Kosovo. The violent actions of military and police since February 1998 were aimed at separatist activities and are no proof of a persecution of the whole Albanian group in Kosovo or in a part of it. The court found that from the end of 1998, both the security situation and the conditions of life of the Albanian population had, quote, noticeably improved, and life in the larger cities had returned to relative normality, unquote. The court's conclusion was categoric. Ethnic Albanians in Kosovo have neither been nor are now exposed to regional or countrywide group persecution in the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. 2 weeks later, on the same day NATO bombing began, Britain's Defence Minister George Robertson told MPs, the Kosovo Liberation Army were responsible for more deaths in Kosovo than the Yugoslav authorities had been. The North Atlantic Council agreed that the KLA were, quote, the main initiators of violence, unquote, in a, quote, deliberate campaign of provocation, unquote. US intelligence warned that the KLA intended to draw NATO into its fight for independence by provoking Serb atrocities. KLA leader Hashim Thaçi told the BBC, we knew full well that any armed action we undertook would trigger a ruthless retaliation against our people. And the tactic finally paid off. After the strongly disputed and most probably staged massacre at Racak, the KLA dream of international intervention became reality. The German Secret Service, BND, together with military intelligence, played a major role in the creation of the Kosovo Liberation Army 3 years earlier. They were in charge of selecting recruits for the command structure. Training and communications equipment was provided by Germany's elite commando force, the KSK. Arms were smuggled in from the former East Germany. Funding was raised by an Albanian foundation known as the Fatherland's Call, with branches in Düsseldorf, Bonn, and other European capitals. Reporters covering the conflict were surprised to find some KLA fighters even wearing German army combat jackets, complete with insignia, in front of the television cameras. Despite this degree of involvement and intervention, Germany's Minister for Europe, Michael Roth, recently complained about the forces of nationalism in the Balkans, forces which his own country did so much to unleash. The ethnic dividing lines in the country are still deep to this day. This is due not least to leading politicians who too often seek to divide rather than reconcile. The fact that there is still no national law criminalizing the denial of war crimes speaks for itself. Those who unashamedly reinterpret historical facts, who neither refrain from worshipping convicted war criminals nor denying the genocide in Srebrenica, deepen these rifts. Targeted interference from abroad often exacerbates the agitation in question. Yet the common ground, the shared worries and needs, the desire for a bright future in a European Bosnia and Herzegovina should be in the foreground. Targeted interference from abroad, particularly Germany, was precisely the problem. Serbia, the traditional enemy, is now successfully branded the pariah of the new European order. German demands for the criminalization of genocide denial by the Serbs are clearly calculated to forestall awkward questions about the continuing, highly embarrassing lack of evidence. In 1992, the distinguished journalist and Balkan specialist Nora Beloff wrote in Die Zeit that the Western powers should be promoting reconciliation between the warring groups and abandoning the policy of confrontation, which it seemed to her was leading to perpetual civil war. In a subsequent article, which the Germans declined to publish, Beloff concluded, "The restoration of peace depends first and foremost on a reconciliation between Croats and Serbs in which neither would be humiliated and in which the blame would be fairly shared. Perhaps a change of foreign minister will see a more balanced policy." The lasting historical guilt of Germany itself for crimes during the Second World War is constantly being sanitized or simply forgotten. The War Crimes Tribunal in Nuremberg brought no indictments against perpetrators of the Holocaust in Yugoslavia, which is why many Germans are still in a state of collective amnesia, a process aided and abetted by German justice. While war crimes committed by Germans on Yugoslav territory remain untried and unprosecuted in German courts, these same courts actively pursue and prosecute citizens of the former Yugoslavia for war crimes in Bosnia. In May 1999, a German court gave Gestapo helper Alfons Gutzfried a 10-year suspended sentence for complicity in the murder of 17,000 Jews. The same month, the German Supreme Court upheld a 13-year jail sentence on Bosnian Serb Nikola Jogic for genocide carried out on 30 Bosnian Muslims. No suspended sentence for him. Not all are equal in the eyes of the German law. This gross injustice and double standard for Serbs is all the product of a successful lie made possible by a massive propaganda campaign. This promoted the myth of an unproven massacre at Srebrenica, which then became the basis of a still unproven campaign of genocide. Momentous political decisions are now legitimized and justified on the basis of a mere assertion, a genocide apparently so self-evident it requires no evidence.
Wir wären ja auch niemals zu militärischen Maßnahmen geschritten, wenn es nicht diese humanitäre Katastrophe im Kosovo gäbe, mit 250.000 Flüchtlingen innerhalb des Kosovo, weit über 400.000 Flüchtlingen insgesamt und einer zurzeit nicht zählbaren Zahl von Toten.
Nicht zählbare Tote schon vor Beginn der NATO-Bombardierung? Die OSZE, Organisation für Sicherheit und Zusammenarbeit in Europa, müsste davon doch gewusst haben, denn ihre Beobachter hatten penibel die Vorkommnisse im Kosovo gemeldet. Ihr Fazit für den März 1999: 39 Tote im gesamten Kosovo, bevor die NATO-Bomber kamen. Drohte also eine humanitäre Katastrophe? Der damals leitende deutsche General bei der OSZE und eine amerikanische Diplomatin, die damals im Kosovo war, erinnern sich.
Die Legitimationsgrundlage für die deutsche Beteiligung war die sogenannte humanitäre Katastrophe. Eine solche humanitäre Katastrophe als völkerrechtliche Kategorie, die einen Kriegseintritt rechtfertigte, lag vor Kriegsbeginn im Kosovo nicht vor.
Bis zum Beginn der NATO-Luftangriffe gab es keine humanitäre Krise. Sicher, es gab humanitäre Probleme und es gab viele Vertriebene durch den Bürgerkrieg. Aber das spielte sich so ab. Die Leute verließen ihre Dörfer, wenn die Serben eine Aktion gegen die UÇK durchführten und kamen danach wieder zurück. Tatsache ist, jeder wusste, dass es erst zu einer humanitären Krise kommen würde, wenn die NATO bombardiert. Das wurde diskutiert. In der NATO, der OSZE, bei uns vor Ort und in der Bevölkerung.
Ein eindeutiges Urteil. Gewalt im Kosovo. In keinem einzigen Bericht der OSZE findet sich auch nur ein Indiz für eine drohende humanitäre Katastrophe.
More than 20 years after the final Balkan War in Kosovo, life for the Serbs is considerably worse. Serbia has just been listed as the 7th poorest country in Europe. It is by far the greatest victim of criminal interference by the international community. Not only was its economy deliberately destroyed by massive and illegal NATO bombing, its recovery is now constrained by a degree of conditionality and political bullying tantamount to continuing sanctions. The damage to the Serbian economy has been estimated at $30 to $50 billion. Unemployment is running at almost 10%, and there's a continuing brain drain. A report by the European Parliament estimates that by 2050, Serbia will lose more than a third of its population compared to 1990. The European Union classifies the Serbian economy as fragile. The prospects for improvement remain uncertain. Successive polls show nearly half of all Serbs now oppose joining the EU, which is still insisting that Serbia recognize the independence of Kosovo as a condition of membership. Growing Chinese influence in Serbia could further complicate EU accession. But for Germany, realpolitik rules. The Balkan Wars provided a golden opportunity to demonstrate greater leadership of Europe, to deploy its military, to enhance its economic power, and bury its past.